And good afternoon, everyone. This is Troy Dumoulin. I am your host for this webinar, and we'll be doing a webinar today on understanding the relationships between Agile, Lean, and DevOps, but I'll throw in a few more elements for the bargain as well. I'll be talking about the connection of other things such as service management, software development lifecycle, project management, and kind of bring an overall understanding to how the scheme of things works together, how the various frameworks and models actually have an affinity and a relationship which is positive. So this session is being recorded so that anyone who's registered to the event can actually get a link afterwards. And I also welcome any time during the session for you to submit a question via the Q&A module. I might wait till the end of the session to get to those questions, but at this point, I welcome anyone who would like to get further clarification or any questions I can answer in the stream of our conversation. So as we begin, let's consider what the driving factor is behind even the question that we're looking at today. So the interesting thing is we are entering a new kind of era for IT management in general. And that era is being spawned by kind of a popular movement towards a lot of these new emerging conversations around Lean, around Agile, around DevOps. And all of these things actually have more in common than you might think. And that is the challenges we're facing today is this concept of working smarter, not harder. Now, that in itself is a statement we've heard before, but why is that relevant in this context? Well, the relevancy here is the challenge that we're facing today is really one of a demand and supply basis. Until this point in our history, we've been able to, through heroic efforts, volunteering our evening time and weekends, pretty much continue to meet demand. We're able to meet demand with adequate supply, or the speed of supply is better. And the challenge we're facing today is that the complexity of our environment, the fragmentation of our processes, the silo nature of our organizations, which are focused more vertically and versus horizontally in a value stream orientation, make it challenging for us to operate at a speed or velocity in which we're able to keep up and maintain a pace that's adequate to demand. So in essence, we're getting higher and higher and faster business demand. A backlog of demand is building, literally a bottleneck, a pressuring on the downstream supply, and this challenge is equating into this general cry and hue of we need to move faster, we need higher velocity, we need to be able to move at scale. And this is the challenge we're facing, and it's really the genesis for this conversation today. So part of that discussion is what we're seeing in the industry is kind of a language wash. So imagine we were having a conversation, just a couple of years ago, and the conversation would have been heavily weighted on the left-hand side. We would have been talking about the maturity or the capability of our practice. We would have been focused on compliance and risk and production assurance. Now, all of these things are important, but the conversation would have been heavily weighted in that classification or those specific set of words. Today, because of this challenge of velocity, there's a challenge to continue to move fast enough to keep up with the pace of demand is, in essence, changing the language. So the conversations that we hear today are all about being fast, achieving speed, being nimble or agile. And so what we're seeing is not so much a shift hard right, but at least a balancing out of both the concept of capability on the left and speed on the right. In fact, if we go hard right and consider and leave behind all of the elements on the left-hand side, well, this is also going to be equally a problem. So in Lean, we talk about the voice of customer, which we'll explore a little bit more in detail as we go through this webinar. But right off the bat, we have to acknowledge that there are other voices in our heads. We can also talk about the voice of regulation. There are simply the requirements, non-functional requirements we have to meet with certain system designs, which have to be met under FDA or SOX or different legislations. There's also the concept of voice of business, which is We have certain economical decisions around what we do based on the fact that, yes, we could do anything, but that concept of doing anything could put the business at jeopardy or at risk. So it's not about forgoing the conversation of the left, and moving hard right to the speed and an agile concept, but it certainly is about finding a faster, more agile, higher velocity way that looks to balance these conversations out. So this language shift is is basically affecting the entire industry we're working with right now. And this is definitely a major part of the conversations that I'm having with customers today. So to give you a premise of how we got where we are, I want to start with the concept of this slide, which I believe is a good way to describe this evolution of thinking around what I'll call accelerants. So Lean has a very rich history. It actually goes back early 1900s to manufacturing era, but the challenges that the manufacturing era faced at that time were very similar to the ones that I just described now. We had a need to operate and build at speed. We had commoditization challenges that were facing us at that time, and we had to find ways to optimize the flow of delivery, not just the quality. And that's one of the key points of difference today. You see, in the previous conversation of maturity, we were focused on quality, and quality is still important, and quality can be both in the context of what is the thing that I'm expecting, and also the non-functional elements of making sure that it is going to be something that is not just feature rich, but also has the warranty aspect to it as well. So quality has never been a challenge. The issue that we're facing now is the flow of value creation across the horizontal value stream. And we'll talk about that in a very generic sense at demand, plan, build, run. And you'll note right off the bat that I put the word demand in front of plan, because we'll talk about Lean's premise of working on a pull system. And today we could talk about that model using a service management conversation of strategy, design, transition, and operation. It's the same concept of a horizontal flow. So Lean brings to the table not just a focus on the quality, establishing voice with customer expectation, but how do I focus on the speed of moving things left to right, if you will. And so in that context, we look at things which kill flow. We look at the fact that when you have waste, things that we shouldn't be doing, this is going to impede flow. When we have defects because of the complexity of a large package of work, that also can kill flow. When we look at things like, too many feedback loops or rework based on not understanding specification or specifications which change dynamically, these things can, in the concept of flow, elongate or lengthen the time to value. So this Lean premise of increasing flow, which can be translated to increasing velocity and speed, began this conversation of how do I not just focus on the thing that must happen, but the speed that it must happen at. And a key concept we'll learn about in Lean thinking is that it's focused on small batch. Rather than create this large batch of work called a project, which is monolithic and it's got, seconding to itself the resources for a fixed period of time. Now let's call it 6 months. The fact is that dynamically priorities can change multiple times during that period. But if I've got this factory component, set up to build and only do this project for 6 months, that means I cannot release the resources attached to that project, apparently for 6 months. And the fact is that things will have changed dozens of times between then and now. So the premise of small batch began and had its birth or genesis in the concept of Lean thinking. Let's complete a small batch of work, find out, what that means from the point of view of value or gain feedback, and then we'll do another small batch of work, which might be in line with the previous, or we might have to shift left or right, depending on the dynamics of prioritization. So this concept of working in smaller batches began at a Lean journey. Where this evolved to was the aspect of Agile thinking. So this small batch premise that Lean began was picked up in the conversation of software development. It made a lot of sense to focus on flow because it was all about speed, but not just flow. We wanted to understand how do we accelerate the feedback loops. So by working on this small batch, called a sprint, we can actually establish the key actions and package of activities that must happen within that sprint time frame, deliver that value in a shorter time frame, though it's not the perhaps total value, it's an iterative approach to value delivery, gain a feedback loop, and then we continue or change directions. So the agile premise of working with small batches had its genesis in lean thinking. Now, the challenge with the agile premise wasn't so much that, it was incorrect in its premise of flow and velocity, is that its focus in the concept of plan, build, run was mostly focused on plan, build. So in the agile world, we focus on accelerating one part of the overall value chain. The interesting observation is that value is actually not delivered or not fully delivered until that value that's being developed is actually in run and operating in a way it's producing the desired outcome. One of the other challenges of understanding flow and velocity is that theory of constraints teaches us that the overall system of value, this demand, plan, build, run system of value, will be governed in its speed by its bottleneck or limiting component. So if you actually optimize one aspect of the total system, but that aspect that you're optimizing is not the constraint or the longest piece in the time frame, then your actual total speed to value is not actually improved. Think of it this way. If I have a bottleneck somewhere in the process and I augment, I optimize, I improve a non-constraint, a non-bottleneck, I'm not actually going to see an overall systemic improvement in the velocity of this value delivery project that I'm working on. The other challenge to this, and this is, again, a lean thinking model, is that not only does the bottleneck or constraint govern the speed of the system, but if any given activity, workstation, person, in this flow becomes overburdened, meaning the work in front of their step becomes now a bottleneck, and they're now overburdened by having too much work to do, the natural inclination is that one activity in an overburdened state will actually begin to slow down. So a key component to lean is called work in progress optimization. If we are not optimizing or limiting the number of steps or actions that are being done in a given step, we can actually denigrate the overall system flow. So this is where we come to DevOps, because in the Agile space, we accelerate one part of the value stream, the plan build. But we don't consider the acceleration of move to production, right? The change and release concepts here. And we're not considering operational requirements and only focusing on the functional requirements. So by not considering the entire value system, plan, build, and run, and only accelerating the plan build side, we're in effect creating a bottleneck in front of run, overburdening the step called move to production, and actually decrementally impacting overall speed of flow. So DevOps comes back and says, we need to think about this from a total value stream perspective. We can't just think about accelerating the front end of the value stream. And so this challenge now is, let's pull it back together as both a dev and ops objective. And so DevOps is basically going back to the lean premise of full value stream optimization. Now, the key of this conversation is that each of these have kind of evolved from the other. Agile began and was genesis from the lean thinking, and so was DevOps. But now they are in their own right, their own kind of discipline or thinking models, and they continue on in parallel as separate but related things. The other side of this conversation is that each of these, lean, agile, DevOps, is an accelerator. It's some way to optimize flow of value generation. The question then you have to ask is, what are they accelerating? Well, this is where we enter into the things that we've always done. We accelerate service management processes. We accelerate software development processes through Agile. We accelerate project management. So it's not possible to think about acceleration unless you also understand that it's accelerating the things that we've always done. So I'm going to bring this back into context when we talk about this at the end of this webinar, is how does this now connect to things we've known for a long time, like the three things at the bottom of the slide. So this is all connected, if you wish. Some interesting observation as well. So annually, Pink Elephant hosts a major conference in Las Vegas in February. At that conference, we ask questions of our customers that are in attendance. You know, what are the current projects that you're working on? What are the initiatives that you're undergoing? And this year's Pink Think Tank research team posed the question to the organizations that were at the conference: what models and concepts are you currently working on, as we traditionally do? Because we were testing our thinking around the challenge of running a multi-speed organization. And so this was the research that came back. This was roughly 100 organizations which responded to this survey. And I want you to note a couple of things about this visual. So everything on the right-hand side is relatively new. I'll put it within the context of the last 3 years. Everything on the left, those are the more classic aspects of waterfall or IT service management. The interesting thing to note, a couple of ways we could look at this, is that everything on the right has been adopted literally in the last 3 years, meaning the speed of adoption of these concepts called Agile, Lean, Six Sigma, DevOps has actually outpaced any previous adoption of frameworks in my own personal experience of 20 years of working in the service management community. As well as look at the division behind the waterfall and the Agile project management. You know, they're roughly 50-50, and most of the organizations that I'm working with right now would be experimenting with Agile at some point. We'll come back to the difference between waterfall and Agile at this moment, but just to point out some of the interesting trends here. These are the things that are currently being worked on. They're not necessarily abandoning the things they've worked on in the past, but their focus right now is on the acceleration aspects to the right. Again, back to this point of the challenge of meeting demand and supply. So let's go a little bit deeper into lean thinking, because this is where it all began. So lean thinking begins in the middle of this graphic. It focuses on how do we maximize value. And as I mentioned earlier, value is not just about what you receive, but it also asks the question of how fast do I receive it, or just in time. And the third dimension of value is at what cost. So it's not enough to provide that value, but I have to do it in a way that's timely and cost effective. So again, I'm sure you're quite aware of the fact that we have a lot of financial pressures that we have to basically deal with as well. So lean thinking and the adoption of lean principles to IT value streams has skyrocketed in the last few years. I'm involved as a volunteer with a Lean IT Association, and it's just amazing to hear the kind of conversations that we're having from different organizations looking to accelerate their various management practices using lean thinking. It begins with this question of who is my customer. That's the yellow symbol here. And if I understand who the customer is, I can understand how to define value and how to define waste in the context of the customer. But it also believes and focuses on the fact that we can't accelerate that which we do not understand. So the first thing we have to understand is how do we visualize how value is delivered? How do I look at the value stream map? A key component here is that what is not defined cannot be controlled, stabilized, or improved. So there's no possibility of improving flow, accelerating flow, unless I know how flow works and how flow is delivered. So this understanding the value stream is the next step. But now I've visualized the value stream, and that value stream could be any process, a software development process, a move to production process, it could be an employee onboarding process. What are the things which kill flow, which are things which should not be there simply because it has no value, aka waste? What are the challenges we're seeing with defect or rework? So we're focusing and analyzing on optimizing speed of flow. Now, another key component, moving on to the green symbol, is that we focus now on the fact that we only have certain capacity for this value system, for this process to basically process anything. So let's ensure that what is being processed in this process is actually prioritized in the context of customer value. So this is where we build a pull system. We prioritize work, be it portfolio work, be it product backlog work, be it the changes in our system, be it requests, whatever the work is. We're pulling the prioritization from the customer, not from an inside but an outside perspective. And of course, we accept that continual improvement is always part of our philosophy, so we pursue this principle of perfection. So these lean principles are what gave birth to the Agile and then DevOps. And so critical to quality is, transferable and translated to minimal viable product. Speed of delivery is this conversation of flow, small batch we've already talked about, work in progress limits, key. Another key component which has been adopted by Agile and DevOps is the visual management aspect of Lean. So a key thing about Lean is a principle called Jidoka. And Jidoka is about making the invisible visible, making problems with flow visible. So how do we do that? We can do it by the use of a Kanban board system, which visualizes this flow of work across the value stream, which has been heavily utilized now by Agile. We can also look at this in day start meetings, also called SCRUM meetings, where we have a board that represents the daily work of the team and the interdependencies and the potential blockages the team will see, but they put it visibly in front of each other so they understand how to best work and flow. These boards support other boards such as weak boards and improvement boards, but this system of visual management boards is critical to this working out loud premise. And there are now many different tool vendors which are taking these visual management tools and building them into their platforms because of the value here. And let's face it, life is too short to work on stuff that doesn't matter. That is the crazy stuff. We've got to remove the waste from our system to get that flow going. So all of this really was the birth of this concept called Agile project management. So how does it differ from classic project management, now sometimes called waterfall? Well, it differs really in the way work is approached. So in classic project management, there's this belief that we can define the business case, the problem statement, and all of the requirements, or at least the majority of the requirements, at the front end of an initiative. And that initiative now is guided through its entire life cycle, 1, 3, 6, 12 months, based on the original premise. And yes, we can have gated stages in this project that allow us to kind of do a sanity check that Agile has given us, but it's still focused on the initial delivery of the initial model defined at the beginning of the project. The challenge with this premise is that it works very well when the environment which the project is running doesn't change dramatically during that period of time, or the priorities of the people even requesting the requirements at the beginning don't change dynamically multiple times during this initiative. Of course, we know that in many cases, especially in the IT context, this isn't the case. So what we're doing here in Agile project management is taking that larger construct and saying, let's break it down into small batches. And so enter the world of Agile, iterative, adaptive development of small packages of work called sprints. Now, involved in this sprint will be, we'll talk about it, a cross-functional team that will basically allow us to accelerate this. An interesting outcome, though, whether you think this is positive or negative, is that in the Agile project management approach, there is no such thing as scope creep, because the goal is that we evaluate our requirements every single time we finish a sprint. So the interesting thing about human nature in this context is, let's say I finish a piece of work or a package of work. I now present that to, of course, the customer paying for this package of work, and they've seen it now for the first time. Now, the normal thing that's going to happen with human nature, as now I see this thing, I'm going to have another 5 ideas. Now, those ideas didn't even occur to me the first time I even sat down and thought about initial requirements, so it would have been useless to try to, brainstorm this earlier. I didn't know and didn't think about it until I actually saw what I now see. So that means that the requirements change dramatically sometimes for the next package of work or next sprint. So we get there in a much more roundabout process, and the product that you end up with at the end of this construct may be completely different than you first began. But the goal here now is that, well, we've been delivering value through iterative sprint and small packages of work. This is good. We've been able to get shorter feedback loops, meaning we're getting an opinion before too much work is done. That's adjusted scope and it's adjusted feature and function. But the end product may look very different than the initial concept. So this concept of controlling scope is really now a very different place with this Agile premise. Of course, this has consequence because the initial cost estimate, which is one of the challenges of doing cost estimates, may be completely different, but each of these is now estimated in smaller bundles. So it's about breaking it down into small batches, if you will. So moving forward in our conversation. So the concept of Agile method, it's understanding where it comes from that begins the conversation, but understanding that unlike some areas, there is no single source of truth for how to actually accomplish Agile project management. We have this lean foundation of belief. You know, what does the customer value? How do I deliver it faster? How do I deliver it in a cost-effective way? All of these discussions we've had about lean have birthed this principle of speeding up and accelerating development. Thus, the Agile Manifesto was born, and it focused on 4 values and 12 principles. These are really a smaller subset of the lean principles, and a subset focused on more of an SDLC project management, but very much in alignment with, it's kind of like an SDL variant, if you will, of lean thinking. And books such as The Lean Startup came up with the concept of minimal viable product, this concept of feedback loops, collaboration. So being agile, in essence, was being lean. From this, though, has been born multiple different variations of how to be agile. And this is only a small list, right? So there's, we have SCRUM, which is probably the most recognizable element, and this is a specific method for doing agile development. But that's not agile. SCRUM doesn't equal agile. SCRUM is a specific variant of being agile. There's another one called Scaled Agile Framework, which is very popular in the US. A Kanban, or Lean Kanban, is kind of an agile methodology using lean terminology. Then you have, as you can see, dynamic systems and development, DSDM, which is significantly adopted within the European parts of the world. The reality is these are different and valid variations, and different organizations apply different models. So extreme programming or Scrum, it's really your choice, or you can combine different elements of them. They're all trying to accomplish the same thing. They're all working in a small batch mode based on this premise of iterative adaptive development versus larger development activity. So these all kind of are born in the same mindset. What it is doing, though, it is changing the terminology about how we look at life, right? So when we look at project management, now we're talking about words that are new. That's language wash that we talked about at the early part of our webinar. So now we're talking about things like a product owner. That's actually a very valid statement. Someone has to have an ownership, a parenting role for this overall thing that we're developing. And that's another interesting outcome of this agile and lean thinking, is it's moving it more to an outcome basis, because that's where the basis of value begins. So the product manager is looking at this from an outcome perspective and looking at how to focus on iterative improvements, new features, increase new warranty improvements to this overall product. So this is also very compatible, as we would know, with service management premise of service. Where it gets a little bit confusing is that the product management concept of DevOps is a little bit more technical. It's more analogous with the concept of a system or an application orientation. So there's an understanding that there is a service outcome, and in that service you might have a product. So understanding the taxonomy differences there is key, But the good thing here is that someone who has accountability for the outcome or the life cycle of that outcome is looking at the total product backlog, the things we would like this product to do in the future when it grows up, working with the sprint team and evaluating a prioritized list of activities for the specific batch of work called a sprint, and then understanding how to optimize its delivery and improve the feedback loops through things like standard estimation, daily scrum meetings, retrospective meetings. Not here to teach Agile today, but the interesting thing here is that, again, to recognize that the language of getting work done is definitely changing. And that's driving a lot of interest in conversations around Agile training, because in essence, we're having to learn a new language to talk about how do we get work done in small batches. Now, just one point of caution before we continue here, and that is we've been talking about the word Agile, and that is a good word, but I want you to think about what Agile typically brings to mind for you. So, you probably think when I ask that question, think of a word that's similar to Agile, you're thinking nimble, flexible, quick off the mark, being able to change directions on a dime. There's lots of different ways we can express Agile. But I want to bring us back to systems thinking, which is where Lean began and DevOps has come back to. And that is, imagine a system of value, various people doing different work in plan, build, and run. But each of the individual agents in that system, and an agent can be a person, it could be a group, right? Each of these agents all have their own view of prioritization and their own view of what comes first and what comes second. So for Agile to actually work, that means the entire system must be aligned in belief, aligned in priority, and aligned in what it thinks first, second, and third looks like. Because if each of the agents in the system, agents in plan, people doing the planning work, people doing the building work, people doing the running work, are all trying to be agile, but they're being agile in completely different directions, then we're going to actually kill flow. So this is where, again, in the Lean premise, it's a systemic perspective, not just the front part of the value system, and where DevOps brings it back to the fact that it has to include operations, because we can actually kill flow, kill speed by being agile. This is a Lean principle called constancy of purpose, coming back to the Lean concepts again. That means that to achieve velocity, which is actually a word that means speed with direction, we actually have to have a view that we share priorities. Right now, one of the ways that DevOps works with this is that they have defined the concept of a DevOps team, meaning I'm going to have a cross-functional team where each of the individuals are representing different parts of the value system, and because they're working as a cohesive team, maybe even co-located, specifically focused on a specific project and or service, then we have, not as many issues with handover and relationship challenges, so we can collectively have a common belief. The family has a common belief. And in this common belief, constancy of purpose, I achieve velocity. It's not that you're required to use a DevOps team to do that, but that's one way to execute on this concept. But it certainly means that we do have to look at the difference between velocity and agile. So let's kind of dig deeper into this conversation of DevOps. So again, coming from this agile premise, we now need to consider the entire value system again. The principles of DevOps. Remember, there's principles of Lean, right? Things we believe in a Lean concept, which generated the principles in the Agile Manifesto. And now we have principles from a DevOps perspective, the things we believe to be true. And because we believe these to be true, we'll act in certain ways and we'll make decisions in certain ways. So the principles of Lean are probably best captured in this now popular acronym by Damon Edwards called C.A.L.M.S. So the principles, we focus on culture, meaning it's not about the people in dev versus ops or plan versus build. It's about the fact that we build value as a cross-functional team horizontally, not vertically. We embrace change, meaning we're not afraid to face the fact that our small batches of work may completely produce different directions. That where we started this journey may not be where we ended up, but where we ended up should be better than we initially planned. So, we're okay with this concept of constant scope creep. Automation. One of the most efficient ways of doing things is to automate it. But that, first of all, means we have to standardize it, right? We can't automate what we haven't agreed on. Now we have to have standard artifacts. So we do want to automate. Again, this is back to lean concepts of machine time. One of the ways we look at optimizing flow is to make it automated. In an IT context, we believe that that's a value that we can bring to the table. Note right in the heart of DevOps, lean thinking, this concept of value systems orientation. Value is the delivery of not just quality, but delivery and cost. Small batch feedback loops. Measurement, of course, how is that different? Well, it's interesting. It's actually now talking more about process measures from a lean perspective, where we go to measures such as cycle time. Cycle time in a lean conversation is the beginning to end of work across the entire value system. And how can I actually shrink cycle time by making, the stuff in the middle less onerous, less wasteful, less full of defect. So by shrinking cycle time, I actually increase velocity. And then there's a principle called lead time in lean, which is the principle of I order it as a customer, when do I receive it? So if I can actually reduce both cycle and lead time, I'm actually improving flow and velocity. So this is the concept of process-driven metrics. And because we're focused on value system generation, sharing means it's not just about us and them. We have this conversation of that we're in this value system together. We need to collaborate. We need to work as a cross-functional team. Again, one of the reasons in a DevOps premise, we talk about building DevOps cross-functional teams, which have their own kind of entity or unit together. Or we're looking at co-location of people in groups that were kind of fractious before, and now bring them together, and they finally, can have a conversation where they deal with their issues. So we believe in the fact that we're stronger together. These are the principles of DevOps. None of them are contrary, and they're all back to this principle of value creation in a lean premise. The practices of DevOps. Now, all right, so the principles are the things we believe. Then what are the practices? What does it actually mean to do DevOps? Which is an interesting question in its own right, because DevOps isn't one thing. And I'm sure you've come up against this in conversations where people will say, well, this is DevOps. Well, no, this is DevOps. Well, an interesting observation is DevOps is actually a collection of things. The word DevOps is more like a mashup, which means DevOps includes all of these concepts. It reminds me of a parable called The 7 Blind Men and the Elephant. And if you've heard this parable, you know where I'm going. But the parable goes like this. So these 7 blind men are basically arguing on a park bench, or a couple, I suppose, about what is an elephant. Of course, never having seen an elephant, they all have their own opinion right off the bat. So they're bound and determined to figure out, what this elephant looks like. So they march down to, find an elephant. And so they each come to this elephant now, and they each grab a different part of the elephant. One guy grabs the tail, another grabs the trunk, another grabs the leg, another grabs the ear. And they say, well, an elephant is, of course, like a snake, right? Or an elephant's like a tree, or it's like this big palm leaf. The reality of the metaphor is that it's yes, yes, and yes. Okay, so think about it this way, starting from the left. DevOps is about structure and teaming. This is the concept of these cross-functional teams dedicated to a specific initiative or service ongoing. It's about, pulling in this concept of lean thinking, systems thinking, where we focused our conversation, removing waste, improving work optimization, work in progress or WIP limit optimization. It's about accelerating through Agile project and software development method. It's about looking at a value system and understanding where are the bottlenecks and how do I optimize the flow by identifying bottlenecks. This is called the theory of constraints. It's also respect of continuous integration and deployment. And this is the principle of getting into trunk management. So I have this concept of, software configuration management. Sound familiar? Where I have code that I pull from a core code repository, now called the trunk, which is interesting from my elephant metaphor just a minute ago. And the fact that we have to have a discipline of software versioning, software check-in, and that check-in should be done continuous throughout the day, because any code developers or developers working off the same code line should be always working with the freshest, most recent version of code. And the principle of continuous deployment is that we automate eventually and get faster at doing releases. And so some releases we can actually do daily, and those releases would be things like the incidents that have to be restored, small enhancements that are low risk, things that have been pre-approved as standard changes because people are using standard artifacts and standard environments, all of these things. So continuous deployment is daily now making deployment changes. But it's not to say that there are not larger deployments which may need a little bit more due diligence. So the conversation around CI/CD also goes into branching, where we have a larger feature build that we need to build out. We branch out from the trunk, and we take a bit more time in this. And in fact, this is where we can get into concepts that are, respective. There's a difference between continuous delivery versus continuous deployment, meaning if the goal is small batch work and getting short feedback loops, I can certainly do that by putting it into a non-production environment, which represents, production. In that UAT environment, gaining the feedback loops I need and packaging now these feedback loops into a larger release called a release, called a branch. The challenge here is that we have to both deal with large complexity as well as small complexity. But the goal is to get more and more standardized, low risk, and automated, obviously. That's the promise of automation and the premise of machine time from a lean perspective. We can do that as well, improve flow by removing defect. How do we remove defect? Well, we stop it from actually, moving down the value stream. So lean, again, back to the principle of Judoka, said first time right. If you see something broken as you're working on it, stop the line, pull the end-on cord. And if you pull the line and stop the line, you fix it, and you don't allow the defect to travel downstream, this will, in an overall premise, improve speed and improve quality and experience. So this has translated into Agile and DevOps. So this first time right premise, shifting quality to the left, all began in this lean conversation of Judoka, making mistakes visible and dealing with them. First time right, quality at the source. These are all the similar types of terms. So how can we do this? We can do this through things like dual programmer, where I'm paired two programmers together, which is the one way to look at the conscience of one programmer being the other. We can get into automated testing, where the code approach we actually take is we're developing, the feature. 1/3 of that is based on the thing it must do. 2/3 of the coding I'm doing is to create automated testing. And that's a different way to architect and develop our product. But in the end, when we've built a self-healing and self-testing application, that allows us for more automation, allows for faster deployment. Now, all of this is, reasonable so far. That probably sounds something like you've talked about in the past. But remember, we're talking about accelerating. What are we accelerating? We're accelerating the things we've already and always done. So come back to now IT service management, project management, software development, and see how this now applies. So here's a slide I like to call service management on the side. So instead of looking at it in a circle, I'm looking at it from a left to right perspective, a value stream oriented perspective. I have demand coming in through the storefront, and that could be strategic demand in relationship to business relationship management. I could have, ordering or requests being done on a catalog. I could have people calling a service desk and saying, I'd like one more of those, please, or I'd like something I don't even have. So all of this is the basis for understanding and how to receive demand. So in a value stream oriented way, we have to have entry points or inputs into our value system. We have to create, in essence, demand channels. These still are relevant because how else would we receive the request to put into the product backlog? All of these sources of demand, strategic, tactical, operational, feed an overall strategic conversation of, well, we've got to make some investment decisions. How are we going to best decide how to, invest our resources and our assets? Some will be on net new delivery. Some will be on investing on technical debt reduction. Some will be on research into completely new technical areas we haven't explored yet. So this conversation of strategy, demand, portfolio, and financial management, it doesn't change because it describes what the prioritized list of things need to be that are worked on. So this is now kind of the macro portfolio, if you will, of the product backlog. With this charter, as we can see in the middle, this factory conversation, now stuff gets done. Right now I have to establish a release. Within that release, I have small packages of work called the sprint. And I'm doing this now through an iterative, adaptive feedback loop premise to the right point I'm ready to deploy. Now, here's an interesting point. How do processes like these service management processes change when we talk about it from a DevOps premise? Well, the things on the left and the things in pink don't really change, okay? What does change is the stuff in the greenish color here. Because remember, in the DevOps world, we now have this DevOps team, which is now a cross-functional team that's connected to the sprint or this ongoing service and is owning the entire life cycle. So left only to voice of customer, I would only think of feature. I would only focus on what the thing must do. But I also have these other voices in my head. Remember, the voice of regulation, the voice of business. These voices speak to us of non-functional requirements. So I still have to think about things like security and availability or disaster recovery or supplier integration or monitoring or support. All of these things are still true. And I still have to find a way to move it into production in a way that doesn't take down the existing services. So how do these process areas change in a DevOps context? Well, remember the DevOps team has a representative from each of the stakeholder groups in the value system: plan, build, and run. That DevOps team should be equipped with the knowledge of not just the feature, but bring to the sprint the requirements from a perspective of these other processes. We might need to put on the DevOps team some specialty members, like a security professional perhaps. But the reality is that team itself brings to the team the information and requirements that are established by these other process areas. Of course, then you ask, well, where do they come from? Exactly the good question here. The reality is it's not for every team to decide what the security or disaster recovery requirements are, or supplier or vendor management requirements. There still has to be this center of excellence, this decision around what are the truths, the policies that we need for these specific things. What are the monitoring policies and disciplines we use in this organization? So that center of excellence still has to exist, and it's pulled from. Now, to use a metaphor, which is an actual metaphor in our industry, this is the way that air traffic control actually works. And the last slide talks about a few podcasts. And one of the podcasts we did, George and I, was with J. Paul Reed around the concept of using aviation best practices for release. Well, in this concept, the FDA, not the FDA, the organization responsible for flight policy and control establish the general requirements for what it means to land a plane at any airport. This includes the minimum equipment list, the things it must have before it takes off and the things it must do before it lands. This association creates a central body of knowledge, a center of excellence, which is then called upon and leveraged by all the other airports. So think about all the other airports like these DevOps teams, but they need this central body of truth so that they're all cohesively working with the same belief system. Again, come back to constancy of purpose. So in that case, what we see in design and transition planning, for the most part, is the DevOps team pulling from this shared truth, with the exception, you'll note, of change management. Change is still focusing on orchestrating all of these in-flight activities. There's large things, small things, pre-approved things. Someone still has to be the control tower, using the flight metaphor still, to basically make sure that they all land in a way that they don't, impede each other and don't land on top of each other. Much of it will be pushed down to low risk and automated premise. We can get into this automated deployment, but there still are larger things which have a larger requirement for due diligence and authority. So it's not in the best interest for every team to basically try to land their own plane without a central control tower. We don't want each team having its own control tower landing on a single runway. So change management is still critical in that context of finding the low path friction path to production, but not a no path, no friction. We still have to govern the flow of change to our production environment. This is change management. And then, of course, we get into operations. We are back to, normal practice. We have to support it. Now, the one thing that might change in the operations sense is that now second and third level is actually the DevOps team as a collective team versus going to one queue for one person, another queue for another person. So these do make changes to how we do these processes, but it doesn't necessarily mean the processes don't exist. We're just applying them differently. And ideally, back to that lessons learned at the bottom, we have a closed loop system that says we need to get better at the whole value premise. So it's key to understand that the build practices in the middle of this diagram are wrappered with this service management construct, because this, in essence, is the entire value system for how value comes in the left and delivered onto the right. So as we close up here on this webinar, just remember this conversation. This is all evolved from practices, principles, beliefs, methods, tools like Kanban and visual management that began with the lean journey, has been picked up by Agile for SDLC, and now DevOps from this broader perspective. One of the interesting concepts is you can take training in each of these depending on your specific focus areas. But I've talked with many people from the point of view of Agile and DevOps that if you really want to sell Agile and or DevOps thinking, if you get people in a lean thinking mindset, the other two are actually taking care of themselves. Because if you learn and understand lean thinking, the other two are just natural, understanding how they apply. And there is no argument, there is no debate. But understand they're connected and they relate to each other and evolved from the beginning of lean thinking. Also remember, you can't accelerate nothing. What does it accelerate? The things we already do, the things on the previous slide. So if you're interested in more, of course, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded right now, and we'll provide the link and be sending that out to everyone who's attended today and those who are registered. But George Spalding and I have spent quite a lot of time thinking and talking about this, and we have a radio show, a podcast, that you'll find on our website, and you can also get it off iTunes, which you can also get from our website. And you'll look at that from the point of view of the following shows which I recommend. So you'll note these shows have to do with Lean, with Agile, with DevOps, talking through some of the examples we've talked through today. This is not a boring podcast. George would let it be so. I think you'll find it entertaining and useful to share with your fellow colleagues and co-workers. So I hope you found today's webinar useful. I think it is a critical question to ask. How do all these things relate, and why are we talking about, speed now? Well, go back to that question of demand and supply. We really don't have a choice. It's either accelerate or become irrelevant. So the pressure is incredible. And that's why my personal belief is that we've seen these words kind of be like a tsunami washing across our industry. It's because of this pressure. The good news is there's an answer. But, just make sure you apply the answer holistically. It's not just one thing. It's considering all of the conversation today together, which is critical and successful. So if there's any questions here, let me see. I must have been very good explaining my premise because there's very little questions. There's a question here about the recording. I've already noted that, and you'll be sent that afterwards. Again, thank you for spending time with us today on this webinar. Look for the next one. Visit Think Elephant's page. You'll be seeing and hearing from us soon. Thank you very much.